So the spirit of Dr. Davanloo's work is understood by my former teacher, Marvin Skorman, and the way Mikkel seems to understand it as well. It has to do with this emotional closeness between therapist and client. Marvin, my former teacher, he would talk about this affection that's so important to feel for the client, this deep affection, this togetherness. I recently had the privilege and great fortune to be given access to one of Mikkel Reher-Langberg's lectures on the overall trajectory of Dr. Davanloo's career. It was an immense pleasure. Mikkel, he's somehow spearheading some kind of impulse to get back to the fundamentals of Dr. Habib Davanloo. And this is me putting in a plug for not just the lecture that I believe will be available soon, but also for the impulse itself. There's something extraordinarily important about getting back to Davanloo. My former teacher, now retired, Marvin Skorman, he would often talk about the spirit of Davanloo's work, and he would agonize that the spirit of Davanloo's work appears to have gotten lost. The more the model has become what Mikkel referred to as technified. I think that's a good word. Not that technique isn't very important, but there's a process of technification and an overemphasis on feelings, actually, when feelings tend to be the result of deep emotional closeness and real contact and openness, genuine openness and total honesty on the part of the client or the patient. Feelings tend to be a natural consequence of establishing that level of contact, which in turn is a result of addressing all the barriers to that contact, which will be different forms of resistance. This is, by the way, something that Mikkel did an extraordinary job highlighting, that the spirit of Davanloo's work, it's about getting after that kind of emotional closeness. Technification of the approach, it runs the risk of watering down that heart, that spirit, where that is lost. The other thing I really appreciated about Mikkel's lecture is that when he spoke about the mature phase, which started sometime in the 80s, I believe, and went to like 1995, I refer you to the lecture itself when that becomes available for those details. But what Mikkel had discovered was that what the new addition to Dr. Davanloo's work was this focus on the will, the pressure on the patient to take responsibility to actually do something in real time, in the context of the actual session, to actually do something about the resistance, right? Not just gain insight into it, not just make links, not just engage in interpretations, but to actually utilize the will to do something to combat the resistance, against the resistance. To me personally, that was the golden age of Dr. Davanloo. This sort of fusion or cross-pollination of the early days and the middle or the mature phase, as Mikkel refers to these periods. That's the sweet spot. That's the golden period from my point of view, where the heart of the model, which has to do with emotional contact, emotional closeness, presence, spontaneity, genuineness, right? That combined with this focus on the will and this strict focus on the resistance until the resistance begins to go into abeyance, until the resistance is relinquished. And then as feelings start to near the surface, then there's this major focus on feelings, but not prior. Not prior. And this is a big point. The way this was explained to me once is that the organizing principle that we're adhering to when we stay more on the resistance and less asking about feelings until the feelings are near breakthrough is that the work is experiential. And so if the patient is experiencing resistance, if that's the main thing going on in the room, then that's our focus. But as the resistance becomes ego-dystonic, as we pressure it, as the patient begins to turn against it and the feelings start nearing the surface, that's when we pounce on the feelings, because that's when the patient is beginning to experience the feelings. So the key thing here is to stay with whatever the patient is actually experiencing in real time. If the patient is experiencing resistance and we focus heavily on feelings, we're giving the patient essentially something to intellectualize about. It's not part of what they're experiencing at that moment. And so by prematurely focusing too much on feelings as opposed to staying more strictly with the barriers to the feelings and to the closeness, we run the risk of going against this primary directive, this primary principle, which is to keep the work experiential. If the patient is engaging a defense or a resistance, that's our focus. If we are talking about anger or sadness, it's because the patient is experiencing some measure of anger or sadness. So the focus is on what the patient is actually experiencing. If we're focused on sexual feelings, it's because the patient is actually experiencing some tingling in their genitalia or what have you, right? So this is a very important principle, to keep the work experiential. And by prematurely, excessively focusing on feelings before the patient is actually experiencing much of feelings, we really run the risk of violating that principle. So again, there is nothing wrong with technique. It's wonderful. All the folks that have done a marvelous job systematizing this model, there's nothing wrong with that inherently. But there seems to be this real risk of, as Mikkel calls it, technification. Technification overshadowing, taking over the spirit of the model. And when that happens, there's no musicality. That's from Mikkel's lecture. Such a good way of putting it. There's no musicality. There's no poetry. We lose the heart, the spirit of the model, just with a bunch of techniques. So I'm not knocking techniques in and of themselves. They're so important to learn. But boy, is it sad when we become technicians and we lose the heart of being present and fostering openness and genuineness and real, authentic communication. That's the heart of it, this presence. So anyway, that was my plug for not only Mikkel's lecture, which I hope will be available soon, but also his overall impulse that he seems to be spearheading, this getting back to Davanloo. And if by that we mean not the late phase of Davanloo, 1995 and on, but if we mean the 80s, right, up to the early 90s, the mature phase, the middle phase, combined with the spirit of the model of the early days. Now, if that's what we mean by getting back to Davanloo, I am 100% throwing my weight behind that.